Hello and welcome to the next economics podcast for PIG A-level economics students on supply side policies and unemployment. I've lumped the two together because quite often the answers to questions will involve some semblance of supply side policy, even if they're asking about unemployment. So firstly, some quick definitions. Unemployment, I won't go through all the types of unemployment, but your definition of unemployment is if you are of working age, in the working age population, you do not have a job and you are actively seeking work. So you need to be actively seeking work of working age in the working age population and to not have a job. For supply side policies, it is an increase in the productive capacity or productive potential of the economy. On our diagrams, supply side policies are always going to move your LRAS curve to the right, and that has the effect of increasing output and lowering prices, which is why they're so desired by governments and economists. If it's on the Keynesian curve, an increase in LRAS, an increase in productive capacity might not necessarily have an impact on output if aggregate demand is on our flat bit and we have spare capacity. Whereas if you're a monetarist, market's always clear, you're always in equilibrium. Any increase in LRAS is going to lower price and increase output. So supply side policies are also very favoured by monetarist economists. I keep banging on about this in lessons and I'll continue to. When you are discussing supply side policies, it is best to look at the current examples, of which there are many. So the first one we'll look at is the change in income tax. So the income tax-free allowance, which is the amount of money you earn until or before you pay any income tax. The threshold of that has continued to rise. It will go up again in April. I think it's £11,500 now. So that income tax-free allowance going up increases the incentive for people to go to work. Therefore, you'll get more people in the labour market. Also, you'll have people that, if they get to keep more of their money, the idea is they will spend it. You'll then have multiplier effects, which would help aggregate demand as well through consumption and disposable income. The biggest downside to this is that there will be a fall in tax revenue. So if you've got a fall in tax revenue at a time where the government has still got a budget deficit, the deficit is falling, but the national debt is going up. Obviously, they need to plug the gap. Tax revenue is going to go down if that tax-free allowance keeps going up. At the other end, the top rate of income tax, which is any income over £150,000 a year, that top rate of income tax has been lowered. It was at 45%, it's now at 40%. And again, that is an incentive, so people work more, an incentive to work harder. And then there's a belief in trickle-down economics. So if people at the top have got more money, that will make its way down to the bottom. The Laffer curve is always good to use to evaluate that. So the Laffer curve will show the disincentive. Other good examples are the HS2 and Crossrail improvements to the railway system currently happening. So HS2 will link London and the south to Manchester and Birmingham much quicker. Crossrail, a bit closer to home, will link central London through to Reading. So this should improve mobility of labour, which will obviously help productivity, which will then move supply to the right. The big downsides of this are cost, time lag, and the potential for government failure. So anytime there's a government project, it might overrun, there might be unintended consequences, policy myopia and all of those things. There's also been increase in the minimum wage. So the minimum wage, now you might see it be called the living wage. It's the same thing. That is soon to go up, if it's not already, to £9 an hour. Again, this is an attempt to give an incentive to go to work. So if people aren't in work, it gives an incentive to work harder maybe, or to get into the jobs market. And again, if it improves people's wages at the bottom end of the income scale, they've got a higher marginal propensity to consume. That should also boost their disposable income, which will boost consumption, which will boost AD. And always remember to go through your chain of reasoning. The biggest downside to the minimum wage are the costs. So you've got the cost to the firms, which might mean they put their prices up, or if staff are too expensive, it could lead to unemployment, which you can easily show via your minimum wage diagram. The unemployment caused by the minimum wage is what's called real wage unemployment. Those people are unemployed because the wage is higher than it was previously. To go alongside this, there has been, I think for the third, maybe fourth year in a row, a freeze in job seekers allowance. A freeze in job seekers allowance with inflation at 3% means that is a real terms cut. This again is an attempt to incentivise people into the jobs market. So the freezing JSA and raising the minimum wage together is hoping to solve what's called the unemployment or poverty trap, where you are better off on benefits than you are if you're in work. So if you freeze JSA and increase the minimum wage, it will help end that. The big downside to that, there's increasing levels of poverty if you freeze job seekers allowance for people that rely on it. There was a report out just this week saying that the life expectancy between the richest and poorest in society in Britain has been growing. Another supply side policy to get more workers in that's happening is the raising of the retirement age. So I think it's now 67 for females, 68 for males. So this increases the working age population, so there are more workers available, but there are obvious downsides in that if people at the top end stay in the jobs market longer, that might impact on youth unemployment, and we've still got a pretty high youth unemployment rate in this country, somewhere between 15 and 20%. And also many people will not want to work until they are that age. So if you're not receiving the state pension until you're 68, it might force people to work longer, which will have a detrimental impact in their later life. The last big policy that the government has been undertaking in the last few years is lowering corporation tax. So corporation tax is the tax that companies pay on profits. This is now at 20%. It's one of the lowest in the G7 biggest economies in the world. This is an attempt to incentivize companies to invest their spending in research and development and investment. So this is where you've got a good crossover. If this is to be able to mention in any paper 3, you've got a good crossover between micro and macro. Cuts in corporation tax will have micro impacts in that it might help firms spend more on research and development. However, they might just give it to shareholders. In a macro sense, your evaluation points are if you are cutting corporation tax, it again leads to less government tax revenue. And if you cut corporation tax, which increases supply, it might not necessarily have a big impact on aggregate demand. So if you've got spare capacity, if you're on your Keynesian flat part of the curve, it's not going to have a big impact. There are many general evaluation points. So when evaluating these policies, you should evaluate the policy specifically. So if you're talking about job seekers, freezing job seekers allowance, specifically talk about things like the poverty trap. But then you've also got general evaluation that will crop up with most supply side policies. The first one is that it's a time lag. These policies generally take a long time to get through. Governments are only elected 4 or 5 years, so they tend to shy away from them. So you've got policy myopia and big time lags. There's also the fact that many of these are costly. So go back to HS2, can either be costly in that the government have got to spend money, or costly in that it means they're getting less tax revenue. So at a time when we've got a budget deficit, these policies are costly. You could always look at aggregate demand. So the question's asking about supply side policies. Should we increase supply? That's great if we're at equilibrium. If we're not, if we're on a Keynesian spare capacity bit and we increase supply, it's not really having that much of an impact. So even though the question's about supply side policies, you can always ask, depends what's happening to aggregate demand. These policies are from the government. So again, a micro or a paper 3 micro macro crossover, it's always worth mentioning government failure. So it could be that there's unintended consequences. It could be there are administrative costs. It could be this policy myopia where they might favour constituents or getting elected. But government failure appears in many of the mark schemes. You've also got the fact that if the question asks about supply side policies or monetary policy or fiscal policy, that doesn't mean you ignore the other one. So if it asks you what fiscal policies could be used, you don't take that in isolation. You obviously talk about the fiscal policies and then you can evaluate by saying, well, however, it depends what's happening with monetary policy, or however, it depends what's happening with fiscal if it's the other way around. One to avoid is education and training. It is not incorrect, but it is the one that students will go to all the time. So how do you increase the productive potential capacity of the economy? Spend more on education and training. Funding and education per head is falling. Obviously, tuition fees are going up to £9,250 a year. That's not exactly an incentive for people to go into higher education. You can use education and training, but you need to be specific and know your stuff. So you might talk about the increase in the school leaving age. You might talk about the apprenticeship levy, where firms have to spend a certain amount of money on apprenticeships. You need to be specific if you are going to use education and training. Education and training, which alongside some of these other policies, such as HS2 and Crossrail, would also have a double impact on your diagram. It's government spending, so AD would go right, and it's increasing productive potential, so LRS would go right. Same with the tax cuts. So if you're getting more in your income, disposable income will go up, consumption will go up, which means AD will go up, but it will also have an impact on LRAS. So if you are doing these policies, remember they have a double impact on the diagram, and make sure you draw the correct new equilibrium. In terms of potential questions, exam questions, remember you should always read the question first and simplify it in your head or write it out. If the question's talking about reducing the rate of unemployment, be sure to talk about what unemployment is mentioned in the extract, if it's a data, or be specific. If it's unemployment in general, then you'll get to choose. But if it's how to reduce cyclical unemployment, make sure you're looking at demand boosting measures. If it's how to reduce structural unemployment, make sure you're looking at the retraining and getting new industry into those areas. It might be how would Britain has a low rate of productivity. So you might get a question on how Britain can improve its productivity, and the best way to do that is going through all of the current examples I went through a minute ago. It might be how to get out of recession or to boost growth. That is a very similar question to the productivity one. So remember to do your supply side policies, but if it's asking how to get out of recession or boost growth, make sure that you also talk about demand side policies as well. It could be a question where you could link the supply side policies into a question. Will economic growth inevitably always lead to inflation? Well, if it's via aggregate demand, yes, but you can always say it depends what's happening to supply on the supply side. If these are accompanied by supply side policies, as I said at the start, you will get economic growth without inflation. With unemployment, the likely questions would be the downsides of unemployment, so that would probably be more likely to be a 15-mark question on an essay. So that would be the downsides to unemployment are on the person, because obviously they're receiving a low income, it's demoralising, their standard of living is going to be low, but you've also got the impacts to the government. So the cost to the government are more benefits paid out, less tax revenue coming in. You've got the social costs, so crime rates usually rise, things like shoplifting and burglary during recessions and high unemployment. And you've got the economic costs. So if someone is not working, then you are not working at your full potential. And as I've already mentioned, other potential questions on unemployment would be solutions. And if it's solutions to types of unemployment, you just need to ensure that you are being specific. Okay, that is all for today on unemployment and supply side policies.